Britain versus Afghanistan, 1842 AD, the Kabul retreat, the snow road of death. This is the story of an army that marched into the Afghan mountains with imperial certainty and walked out as a ghost. Winter has sealed the passes. Kabul sits under a lid of cold grey sky, its mud walls frosted white, its bazaars hushed by fear and hunger. Inside the British cantonment, thousands of soldiers and camp followers are pinned in a city that never wanted them. Their flags still flutter, their cannons still stand. But the wind that snakes down from the Hindu Kush carries a different message, now not victory, but a slow, tightening doom. Here is the first hard truth, a number that still chills historians. Nearly 16,000 people, soldiers, families, servants, and allies will attempt to escape Kabul in January 1842. Almost all of them will vanish along a single road. And yet on this night, before the retreat begins, the British officers still argue by lamplight. They still imagine treaties, honorable terms. Outside their walls, Afghan riders slip through the snow like wolves. In the dark valleys beyond the city, fires burn in scattered camps. And every flame marks a tribe that has chosen war. One question hangs in the frozen air, unanswered and terrifying. When dawn comes, will the road out of Kabul be a path to safety, or a corridor built for slaughter? They came to Afghanistan the way empires always come, with maps that looked clean and confidence that looked permanent. The British Empire was at its height, its ships ruling the oceans, its armies seasoned by conquest. In Calcutta and Sindh, the men who governed India watched the northern horizon with anxious eyes. They had heard rumors of Russian envoys moving through Central Asia, whispers of Cossack boots one day reaching the Khyber. The fear was not yet real, but fear never needs reality to become policy. It only needs imagination and a rival. So they decided Afghanistan must be a shield, a buffer kingdom, controlled by a ruler who would smile at British gold and open his gates to British influence. Their choice was Shah Shuja, a deposed monarch living in exile, a man with old blood and fading authority. Restoring him, they believed, would buy loyalty and stability. In truth, it brought only resentment. Afghans knew Shah Shuja as a king returned on foreign bayonets, a shadow pushed ahead of an empire's spear. The invasion began in 1839. Columns of red-coated infantry and sepoys marched through the Bolan Pass, dragging artillery like iron insects across rock and dust. They toppled the existing ruler, Dost Muhammad, with stunning speed. Kandahar fell. Ghaznī's fortress gates were blown open in a night of thunder and smoke. By summer, British standards were raised in Kabul itself. The campaign looked like a masterpiece, a swift victory in rugged country, a throne restored. A rival forestalled. London congratulated itself. The newspapers spoke of civilization advancing into the mountains. But Kabul was not India. It was not a flat plain to be ruled by forts and roadways. Kabul was a knot of tribes, family loyalties, and honor codes so old they had the weight of stone. A man did not follow a king because a king wore a crown. He followed because oaths had been sworn, because alliances had been forged in blood, because a leader had proved himself in the dust of battle. Shah Shuja proved none of these things. He arrived behind British guns, and his palace smelled of foreigners. At first, the occupation seemed almost comfortable. The British built cantonments outside Kabul, sprawling camps with parade grounds, storehouses and neat rows of tents. Officers brought their wives, children, and servants. There were dances and dinners, fox hunts in the foothills. Gossip carried on the cold air. They tried to recreate a small England in a city that watched them with silent hostility. The Afghans were polite in the bazaars, cautious in the streets, but their eyes remembered every past invader. The British command in Kabul became a strange creature, half army, half court. Its senior political officer was Sir William Macnaghten, intelligent, ambitious, and convinced that Afghanistan could be managed by subsidies and diplomacy. The military commander, General William Elphinstone, was aging and ill, a man who had once been brave but had drifted into hesitation. Between them lay a gap that grew wider each month, politics pulling one way, military reality pulling another, and below them, in the ranks, soldiers who had marched across deserts now shivered in a place where winter was not a season but a weapon. The key to British control was money. They paid tribal chiefs to keep the passes quiet and the roads open. They paid for loyalty the way a merchant pays for grain. It worked only as long as silver flowed. But in 1841, under pressure to cut costs, the subsidies were reduced. To British accountants, it was a line item. To Afghan tribes, it was an insult written in currency. If you lower the price of a man's loyalty, you announce that you have never understood it at all. Around Kabul, tension gathered like snow clouds. Tribes that had tolerated the occupation began to test it. Caravan routes were raided. Messengers were killed in lonely valleys. Small outposts vanished in the night. Inside the city, mullahs preached that foreign boots defiled Afghan soil. The old warrior families watched Shah Shuja's weakness and smelled opportunity. Thus Muhammad, though exiled, remained a living symbol of resistance. Even those who disliked him preferred an Afghan ruler to a puppet. In the bazaars, rumors moved faster than armies. They said the British were destroying Afghan customs. They said Shuja's rule would never be accepted. They said Russian aid might. Kamei said, and this was the most dangerous whisper of all, that Britain's grip was softer than it looked. There were men in Kabul who understood what was coming. A young officer might notice the way crowds lingered too long at street corners, or the way friendly smiles had turned into guarded stares. A supply officer might see that merchants were hoarding grain. A cavalry scout might report more riders, or in the hills, than there had been last month. But the higher command heard these things and filed them under local unrest. They assumed the Afghans would grumble, then submit. They had seen rebellions before. They had crushed them in India and Burma. They believed the pattern of empire was universal. The first payoff of reality came like a slap. One morning, a convoy bringing vital supplies into Kabul was attacked in the passes, not by a few bandits, but by organized tribal fighters who struck from high ground with deadly patience. Men died. Pack animals scattered into ravines. The road was closed, and when the reports arrived at the cantonment, they did not feel like a warning. They felt like a forecast. If this story is gripping you so far, stay with it, and when the first blood of the retreat is spilled, come back and tell me what you think the British should have done differently. And if you want more war like this, make sure you're subscribed and with us for the next march into the dark. Macnaghten tried to negotiate. He invited chiefs, offered gifts, promised restoration of payments, and the meetings were courteous, but the eyes across the rugs were cold. The Afghan leaders were no longer bargaining for money. They were bargaining for dignity. And empires cannot buy what they have already trampled. The British soldiers, meanwhile, were trapped in a camp built for comfort, not defense. The cantonment sat on low ground, overlooked by hills and villages. Its walls were weak. Its magazines were inconveniently placed. It was, in the harsh geometry of war, a bad position. Any competent enemy would see that. The Afghans did. Winter deepened. The passes whitened. The city's mood hardened. A spark was coming, and everyone could feel it, but no one knew where it would land. Then, in early November 1841, the spark struck. A crowd gathered in Kabul, not as a riot at first, but as a protest swelling with anger. Afghan fighters surged toward the house of a British officer, Alexander Burns, a man respected for his knowledge of local ways, but still a symbol of foreign power. Burns tried to calm them, tried to reason. The mob broke in. He was killed. His body was dragged through streets that roared with something older than hatred, the fury of a people who had decided that the time for patience was over. When the news hit the cantonment, it was like hearing a fortress gate splinter. The occupation had changed shape in a single hour. This was no longer simmering discontent. This was uprising. Elphinstone froze. Macnaghten hesitated between diplomacy and force. Troops were sent out in half measures, then called back. Orders contradicted each other. Afghan fighters, seeing this paralysis, grew bolder. The hills around Kabul lit with signal fires. Tribes poured into the city. Supply depots were attacked. British patrols were cut down in streets they had thought secure. And all the while snow kept falling. It muffled the sound of gunfire and carried it farther. It covered the dead and made the roads slick with ice. It was as if the land itself was closing over the invaders. By late November, the British garrison was not besieging Kabul. Kabul was besieging them. Their food stores dwindled. Their allies deserted. Each day brought new attacks. Each night brought colder temperatures and darker rumors. The decision that would doom them had not been made yet. But the road out of Kabul was already waiting, hidden beneath snowdrifts and the eyes of men who knew every bend. The British still believed they could negotiate their way to safety. The Afghans were already shaping the retreat into a trap. Somewhere beyond the city, in the white, narrow throat of the passes, The snow road of death was opening its jaws. Kabul did not erupt like a single explosion. It cracked the way ice cracks on a river, first a thin line, then a spreading web, then the whole surface giving way at once. After burns fell, the city became a living thing in revolt. Roofs filled with watchers, alleys filled with men carrying jaziles and toa. The call to prayer rose in the frozen air like a drumbeat, and every syllable seemed to say the same thing: drive them out. Inside the cantonment, the British felt the ground shifting under their boots. At first there was disbelief, then anger, then the sickening realization that they were outnumbered in a city whose streets they did not own. The parade grounds that had once hosted music and laughter now hosted anxious formations, lines of infantry stamping their feet for warmth. Muskets clutched as if they might be swept away by the cold itself. The women and children were moved into the safest tents. Servants whispered prayers in Hindustani. Horses shied at the sound of distant gunfire. MacNaughton rode between barracks and council tents, holding the occupation together with words. His mind still clung to the idea that Afghanistan could be soothed back into order, that rage could be paid down like a debt. But every ride brought new evidence. Tribal banners appeared on slopes beyond the camp. Messengers arrived with mangled bodies. The bizarre routes that fed Kabul were now blades pointed inward. Even the king's palace, Shah Shuja's battered throne, trembled under the pressure of a city that spat at his name. Elphinstone's indecision became its own enemy. He was not a coward in the simple sense. He was worse, a man caught between old habits and new terror. Each hour brought a different proposal. One moment he wanted a bold sortie to retake the city. At the next he wanted to hunker down and negotiate. His staff waited for orders that never landed with weight. His soldiers learned, with growing dread, that their fate was being directed by hesitation. On a bitter morning, an urgent report arrived. The great supply fort at Balahissa was safe, but the stores in the cantonment were shrinking fast. Worse, the main magazine of food and ammunition sat not inside the camp but in a separate fort, poorly defended a short march away. The Afghans knew this. Their scouts watched it day and night from the ridges. If that fort fell, Kabul would become a noose that tightened by starvation. A column was assembled to reinforce it, red coats and sepoys marching out with bayonets, glittering dully under a pale sun. The road ran through open ground edged by villages. Those villages were quiet in a way that felt wrong. Doors closed. Smoke rose from roofs like thin, cautious signals. When the column reached the fort, Afghan fire lashed out from the surrounding walls. Bullets stitched the air. Jazil shots, heavy and accurate, punched through wall and flesh. Men staggered and dropped into the frost. The British returned fire, then tried to push forward, but the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once behind mud walls, in crumbling towers, on rooftops that seemed to grow guns like thorns. They fought through, to the ford, but at a cost, and the cost carried a lesson sharper than any blade. The Afghans were not a mob anymore, they were a war. The next days became a blur of sorties and counterattacks, every ridge line above the cantonment filled with riflemen. Every attempt to move supplies drew ambush. The British guns thundered, in reply, scattering snow from slopes, but each shell that burst in empty huts only deepened Afghan fury. In the camp hospital, surgeons worked until their aprons froze stiff, sawing limbs in candlelight while men bit on leather straps to keep from screaming. Then came the disaster that sealed their fear into certainty. The separate magazine fort, the one holding their lifeline, was attacked in force. Afghan fighters stormed the walls with ladders, shot down the defenders, and set fire to the stores. Flames rose into the winter sky. Smoke rolled toward Kabul like a funeral veil. From the cantonment, British soldiers watched the blaze and understood what it meant. Their food was burning, their ammunition was burning, their future was burning. When the fort finally fell silent, a strange quiet spread through the cantonment. Men did not cheer. Men did not curse. They simply stared as if their eyes could pull the fire back into safety. In war, there are defeats that cost territory, and there are defeats that cost hope. This was the second kind. MacNaughton pressed for negotiations. He sent messages to the Afghan leaders, proposing terms. At their head was Akbar Khan, the fierce son of Dost Muhammad, a man with the bearing of a warrior prince and the instincts of a hunter. Akbar was young, but he carried his father's legitimacy like armor. He was also unrelenting. To him, The British were not guests turned enemies. They were invaders who had finally bared their throats. The talks began under a veneer of ceremony. Rugs were laid in a snow-dusted garden. Tea was poured into cups that steamed in the cold. Both sides spoke of honor and peace, but behind the words lay two different worlds. MacNaughton needed a way out without admitting defeat. Akbar needed a surrender that tasted like justice. The more they talked, the more the British slipped into contradiction. They offered to leave, then hesitated. They offered hostages, then retreated from the offer. They promised money they could no longer deliver. Each wobble was read by the Afghan leaders, not as caution, but as weakness. And weakness, in Afghan memory, was a crime. Night after night, Afghan marksmen tightened their ring. Their jizzalis were long and ugly, but deadly. In practiced hands, the British found it hard to believe at first that single shots could drop officers from hundreds of yards away. Then they saw it. A sentry lifted his head above a parapet a cracker code. He folded backwards soundlessly. A young lieutenant stepped out to check a picket line. A bullet hit his chest, and he fell with frost already forming on his lips. Fear began to do what hunger had not yet done. It began to unravel morale thread by thread. Inside Kabul, Shah Shuja's palace became a cage. The king sent pleas to the British, begging them to hold firm, to crush the rebels, to save his throne. Yet he could not step into the streets without risking death from his own people. His guards were loyal only because they were paid, and even they were beginning to look at the mountains the way men look at a door in a burning house. On December 23rd, the negotiations reached their strangest moment. MacNaughton agreed to meet Akbar Khan outside the cantonment for a private exchange. Some British officers were uneasy. They asked why their chief diplomat was going without stronger escort. MacNaughton, still certain that he could bend Afghanistan back into shape with personal finesse, waved their worries aside. He believed Akbar wanted a settlement. He believed his own authority would impress the young prince. He believed, above all, but he was not in mortal danger. The meeting place lay in a stretch of open ground. Snow crusted hard, the air thin and sharp. MacNaughton arrived with a small party of officers. Akbar came with his own men, riders whose horses snorted plumes of steam. They dismounted. They spoke. Their voices were calm, almost cordial. Then the air changed. No warning, shout, no dramatic gesture. Just a sudden surge forward as Akbar's men seized MacNaughton, dragging him toward their horses. The British officers reached for pistols, stunned into slowness. Akbar himself grabbed MacNaughton, and in a heartbeat the diplomat was no longer a negotiator but a captive. A shot cracked. A blade flashed. MacNaughton dropped into the snow, his blood spreading dark and shocking against the white. The officers who survived fled back to the cantonment, like men running from a nightmare they could not describe. The camp received them in disbelief. At first, no one accepted it. MacNaughton dead, the Empire's voice in Kabul, cut down in the open, but disbelief died quickly under the weight of truth. The murder was more than a killing. It was a message carved into winter. There would be no gentle settlement. There would be no safe comfort under British flags. The rules had changed, and Kabul had chosen the rules. Elphinstone's health collapsed with his confidence. He withdrew into his quarters, issuing faint orders through trembling hands. With MacNaughton gone, the political spine of the occupation snapped. Officers argued openly. Some demanded a breakout to the fortress of Jalalabad. Others insisted they still had to negotiate because the camp could not survive a siege. The Sikhs listened to these arguments and felt their own dread harden into anger. They had marched for a war that was supposed to be quick. Now they were trapped in a freezing bowl, led by men who couldn't agree on the shape of tomorrow. Akbar Khan, meanwhile, rode through Kabul as a hero. MacNaughton's body was paraded, cut apart, displayed. The city roared approval. The tribes saw it as proof that the foreigners could bleed, and when an enemy bleeds, the mountain grows hungry. A new offer arrived the next day, carried by Afghan envoys whose faces did not soften. They promised safe passage out of Kabul if the British surrendered their guns, their treasure, and their honor. They demanded hostages, they demanded withdrawal, and they demanded it now, before the snow closed the passes entirely. They left Kabul before the sun had fully climbed the rim of the mountains, as if ashamed to be seen retreating in daylight. The gates of the cantonment creaked wide, and outpoured a river of humanity that did not look like an army anymore. Red coats marched with muskets slung low. Sepoys shuffled beside them, wrapped in whatever cloth they could steal from the cold. Wounded men limped on makeshift crutches. Behind the soldiers came the non-combatants in a long, helpless tail. Officers' wives under blankets, children strapped to servants' backs. Merchants, grooms, cooks, camp followers, laborers, whole families who had tied their fate to the British camp. Ox carts groaned under luggage. Camels lurched forward with bells muffled by frost. The column stretched on, nearly 3 miles of Bodas, stepping into a world of white silence. At the head rode a small escort of Afghan horsemen, sent by Akbar Khan. Their turbans were wrapped tight against the wind. Their expressions revealed nothing. They did not look like guides. They looked like men supervising a sentence. The first miles felt strangely calm. Kabul fell behind, its mud walls receding into haze, and some men dared to believe the agreement might hold. Snow lay shallow on the plain, and the road was broad, enough for formations. Elphinstone rode near the front, hunched in his saddle like a sick man on a funeral cart. The officers kept close to him, watching the ridgelines, listening for any telltale crack of Jazeel fire. But the hills did not speak yet. They only watched. Then the road narrowed, and the land began to rise toward the passes. The cold sharpened. The wind grew teeth. The column entered the first defile, a gorge where cliffs leaned inward and the sky became a thin, pale strip above. Here the silence broke. A shot rang out from high ground to the left. A British soldier in the vanguard jerked backward and fell into the snow, then another shot, and another. The sound echoed against rock, multiplying like ghosts in a chapel. Men ducked instinctively, looking up, but the shooters were hidden behind boulders and folds of stone. The Afghan escort at the head did nothing. They did not shout, they did not signal, they simply rode on, as if this was weather, not war. Breaches fired back, musket volleys bursting upward in ragged anger. The smoke drifted uselessly into the wind. Jazeels answered from the cliffs with slow, deliberate rhythm. Every Afghan bullet seemed to find flesh. The column bunched in panic. Carts collided. Camels shrieked and reared. A woman screamed for her child. For a moment the retreat turned into a jammed artery. Blood and breath trapped in a narrow throat. Officers shouted to push forward. Keep moving. Keep moving. But movement was harder than command. The road was slick. Men slipped. Pack animals refused to advance where bodies lay. And from the heights, Afghan fighters began to appear in ones and twos, darting between rocks. Like shadows with rifles up by afternoon, the snow thickened. The column finally staggered out of the defile and into a broader valley. They were supposed to camp near Tezan, a small settlement where Akbar Khan had promised supplies. Instead, they found empty ground and wind that smelled of coming night. The first camp of the retreat was chaos stitched into darkness. Tents went up, crooked or not at all. Fires sputtered, fuel scarce. Men huddled in clusters, breathing into their hands, staring at the distant ridges where they could see small pinpricks of light. Afghan campfires, watching fires. As the temperature dropped, the retreat's true enemy revealed itself. Hunger could be fought by rationing. Bullets could be fought by steel. But cold was a quiet killer. It worked through the night while men slept. It stole sensation from fingers and toes, then stole movement, then stole life. Sepoys, lacking winter gear, suffered first. Some tried to warm themselves by crowding around fires until sparks burned holes in their clothing. Others lay down, exhausted, and did not rise. Before dawn, Afghan scouts rode into the camp. They brought a message from Akbar Khan. The British must hand over more hostages, including senior officers and their families, to guarantee safe passage. It was a demand wrapped in the language of protection. Elphinstone, hollow-eyed and shaking, agreed. A handful of frightened women and pale-faced children were lifted onto Afghan horses and carried away into the grey morning. Some soldiers watched them go, and felt their stomachs turn in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. The agreement had barely begun, and already it was eating their people. The march resumed, and every step now had uncertainty baked into it. Men asked each other in hushed voices whether Akbar was truly controlling the tribes. If he was, why did the shooting continue? If he wasn't, why had they trusted him at all? No one had a solid answer. All they had was a road that drew them deeper into the mountains, like a law. The second day brought the first avalanche of despair. The column reached another narrow pass, tighter than the last, with sharp bends and steep slopes that funneled them into a killing corridor. The Afghans struck in force. Rifle fire rolled down from both sides. Rocks tumbled from above, dislodged by Afghan hands, smashing carts and men alike. The British tried to deploy into firing lines, but there was no space. The best soldiers in the world cannot form neat ranks in a canyon that barely fits a wagon. A cavalry charge was ordered, a desperate attempt to clear the heights. Horses plunged forward on icy ground, hooves skidding. Afghan fighters stepped aside and let the riders pass, then shot them in the back. A lieutenant's horse screamed as it fell, pinning him beneath. He clawed at the snow while bullets hammered around him. His men heard his cries until a final shot cut them off. By noon, the retreat no longer looked like a column. It looked like a scattered herd being hunted. Groups broke away seeking shelter. Some tried to climb to higher ground, only to be picked off. Others ran forward without orders, trying to outrun the fire. The camp followers, caught in the middle, died in waves. A mother who stumbled could not get up before the crush trampled over her. An old groom collapsed beside the road, and his camel wandered on without him, bells tinkling softly above the man's last breath. When they finally emerged from that pass, they had lost hundreds. No one knew the number exactly because no one could count anymore. Dead men were left where they fell. Their bodies became dark lumps dotting the white road behind. It felt like the mountains were marking their progress with graves. That evening, Akbar Khan himself rode into their shattered ranks. He came with a larger escort, flags snapping in the wind. The British officers gathered around him as if around a judge. He spoke smoothly, condemning the tribesmen who had attacked, promising punishment, promising safety ahead. His face showed concern, perhaps even pity. Then he made another offer. If the British handed over their remaining artillery and a larger share of their treasure, he would personally escort them through the worst of the passes. There was no subtlety to it. Their survival was being bargained away in pieces. Some officers wanted to refuse, to fight their way free. But fight with what? The guns were half frozen. Ammunition was dwindling. Men were collapsing by the score. Elphinstone, too weak to argue and too frightened to gamble, accepted. The cannons were surrendered. Great iron mouths that had once thundered at Ghazni were now hauled away by Afghan hands. As they disappeared into the snow, British soldiers looked on as if watching their own teeth being pulled out one by one. Night fell. The Afghan escort ringed the British camp, not as protectors, but as keepers. Their fires burned brighter now. Closer, the British fires burned lower. In the darkness, a new whisper began to spread through the ranks like frost through cloth. Some said Akbar was saving them. Others said he was stripping them before the kill. A few said there were secret orders for the tribes to let none escape. And still, the march continued. Day 3 opened under a sky the color of lead. Breath turned to crystals in beards. The wounded no longer cried out. They had passed into a quiet state that was either courage or shock. Halfway through the day, the road narrowed again into a twisting defile. This one was different. Its walls rose higher. Its turns were sharper. Snow lay deeper, hiding stones and bodies alike. The Afghans were silent on the ridges, too silent. Elphinstone's officers glanced at one another. The men tightened their grips on muskets. The column pushed forward into the throat of the pass, and the stillness became unbearable. The kind of stillness that makes the heart race, because it feels like a held breath then. From far ahead came a sound that was not gunfire. It was shouting. Not British shouting, Afghan shouting. Fast, excited, hungry, it rolled toward them like a wave breaking over rock. The first figures appeared at the bend, not a few riders, but a swarm. Tribesmen pouring down the slopes, rifles raised, blades glinting. Their war cries bounced between cliffs until the gorge seemed alive with them. The British front ranks hesitated for a heartbeat, and in that breath the mountains seemed to lean closer. Behind them, the rear ranks heard the cries grow louder, could not see what was coming yet, only that something was coming fast, and the snow road of death, which had been stalking them mile by mile, finally sprang from the ridges in full view. The gorge swallowed them whole. For a few terrible seconds, the British front ranks tried to pretend that what they saw was manageable. A swell of tribesmen, yes, but surely a burst that could be checked by discipline. Officers screamed 4 lines to form, 4 muskets to level, for the men to stand. The soldiers obeyed on instinct, lifting weapons with fingers already numb and cracked. A volley tore forward, the sound harsh and flat in the thin air. A few Afghans fell, black shapes tumbling into white drifts. Then the gorge answered with a roar from both sides. From above, from behind, gunfire erupted in sheets. The Afghans were not a wave. They were the sea itself, breaking from every ridge, and crevice. Jazal bullets snapped down into the crowd, choosing targets with a cruel calm. The tribesmen poured into the road, leaping over rocks, firing from the hip, slashing at anyone who stumbled. Their blades flashed like sudden stars in a storm. Their cries were not rage alone, they were certainty. The column broke. It did not collapse in one clean fracture. It shattered in dozens of places at once. The front surged forward to escape the kill zone, trampling the slow at the middle, panicked, and tried to turn back. The rear heard the firing echoing toward them and pressed in, tightening the knot. Carts jammed sideways. Animals screamed. The road became a crush of bodies and snow and terror. Men who had marched through deserts under the Union Jack now found themselves fighting to breathe, fighting to stand, fighting simply to keep from being crushed beneath their own people. A sepoy fell beside a wagon wheel, his hands outstretched, eyes wide, pleading in a language no one had time to hear. A British sergeant grabbed his collar, tried to haul him up, and in that instant a Jazeel ball punched through the sergeant's throat. He dropped without a sound, still holding the other man's coat as if unwilling to let go of the last thing that felt human. Somewhere in the chaos, officers tried to rally small knots of soldiers into a barricade, firing from behind boulders, stabbing with bayonets when tribesmen closed. For a few minutes, the old machinery of war flickered alive, muzzle flashes, shouted commands, a stubborn defense. But each time a group steadied itself, fire came from higher ground and raked it apart. The Afghans owned the heights. They owned the bends. They owned the patience to let panic do half their killing. Hours later, when the gorge finally widened, what staggered out into the open could barely be called an army. Their faces were grey with cold. Their uniforms were torn, stained, and stiff. Many had thrown away packs and even muskets to run faster. Behind them, the pass was littered with the shapes of those who hadn't reached the widening dark lumps already hardening under fresh snow. Akbar Khan rode in again that afternoon, as calmly as a man arriving at a marketplace. He looked over the bloodied remnants with a soldier's eye. His expression carried neither triumph nor apology. He spoke with the same velvet voice as before. He said the tribes were beyond his control. He said he was trying, but anger had a life of its own. He said the only way to prevent further slaughter was for the British to place themselves more fully under his protection. And protection, again, required guarantees. More hostages. This time the demand reached deeper. Senior officers, their wives, their children, the very people whose presence had once made Kabul feel like a civilized posting instead of a war. Some officers argued, their voices cracked from cold and disbelief. Elphinstone looked at the dead around him, at the desperate faces awaiting his decision, and felt the walls of choice closing. He agreed. The hostages were gathered in a hollow silence. Women wrapped in shawls, children half asleep, officers with jaws clenched tight enough to split teeth. They were handed to Afghan guards who promised safety with eyes that revealed nothing. The captives were led away into the falling snow, their figures shrinking toward the mountains like a memory being erased. Those left behind watched them go, and a thought began to settle through the column like poison. Akbar was not escorting them to safety, he was dismantling them, piece by piece, so that nothing remained but a carcass easy to finish. That night, the cold turned savage. The survivors camped in shallow hollows beside the road, too exhausted to dig proper shelter. Fires were tiny, starved for fuel. The wind found every gap in cloth and bone. Men huddled together until their breath pooled into a misty cloud above them, and still the cold kept biting. It did not feel like weather anymore. It felt like a living enemy circling just outside the firelight. Through the night, bodies quietly stopped moving. A man would sit upright one moment, eyes open, then lean against a comrade and never breathe again. A child would cry for warmth, then go still, face turned into a mother's chest. When morning came, the snow around the camp was dotted with those who had frozen exactly where they had tried to rest. Their faces looked peaceful in a way that shamed the living. At dawn, the march resumed, but it was no longer an ordered retreat. It was a flight attached to a road. The column had thinned drastically. The healthiest walked in a grim trance. The wounded were dragged on blankets until the blankets frayed and the dragging stopped. The camp followers were almost gone, their carts emptied by death or abandonment. A few officers still rode horses, but more and more were on foot, leading their mounts by frozen reins, because the animals were too weak to carry them. The passes ahead had names the British barely knew: Jugdulek, the narrow gullet. Off the mountains where one ridge could command 1,000 men below, For the Afghans, these were not names, but home. Every boulder was a familiar ally. Every slope was a blind. Every bend of the trail was a place where a man could wait unseen, until the perfect second to strike. The attacks became relentless. They no longer came in dramatic waves. They came like rain. A crack from the ridge, a man down. A cluster of riders rushing in to snatch a straggler. A sudden rush into the rear where men were too exhausted to raise muskets quickly. The British tried to keep tight formation, but hunger and cold tore at discipline. The column stretched into a long, vulnerable line, and the Afghans nipped at it until it bled from every seam. Midday brought another horror. The British reached a village where they had been promised bread. They found doors barred, roofs vacant, silence like an insult. Some soldiers broke into houses and found only cold ashes. Others searched the outskirts and returned, shaking their heads. The village had been emptied days ago. There would be no food except what could be taken from the dead, so they took it. Men tore open packs from frozen bodies, chewing hard biscuits flecked with blood. Some fought over a handful of grain as if it were gold. A corporal saw a Sikh tugging at a dead mule's hide and did not stop him. The retreat had dragged them past the edge where pride lives. Now there was only survival, and survival was ugly. Toward evening, the road climbed into a ridge-lined corridor that felt like the spine of a beast. The snow here was deeper and the air was thinner. The column moved in a stagger, each step a negotiation with pain. Ahead, they could see a dark line of rocks across the path, like a low wall thrown up by nature. It looked harmless at first, then they saw figures behind it. Afghan fighters stood there in clusters, rifles ready, the last light of day glinting off barrels. Higher up, more silhouettes appeared on ledges. The road was blocked. The heights were alive. A hush fell over the British front, the kind of hush that comes when men realize they're about to be tested for the final time. Officers passed word down the line. Fix bayonets. Close ranks. Close ranks. Push through. The bayonets clicked into place with a sound like teeth being bared. Men tightened their grip. Some whispered prayers. Some stared forward with glassy, faraway eyes. They began to advance. The first shots cracked from the rocks. The front rank faltered, then kept moving. Another volley hit, and men fell into the snow so hard it puffed up around them. Still the survivors pushed on, stepping over bodies, stabbing toward the wall. They were close enough now to see Afghan faces, fierce, calm, certain. The distance between them shrank to a few dozen yards. And then, from behind the barricade, a horn sounded low, sharp, unmistakable, not a signal to fire, a signal to close. The Afghans rose as one and surged down toward the road, rifles slung, blades out, moving with the confidence of men who had waited for this moment all day. The British line met them halfway, and the mountain corridor filled with steel and screams. In the failing light, with snow swirling like ash, the retreat reached another edge of catastrophe. And somewhere beyond this blocked ridge, unseen but near, lay the next pass, narrower, higher, and waiting to decide whether any of them would ever see Jalalabad at all. By the time the blades met in that narrow corridor, the retreat had become something raw and ancient. There was no empire left in those men, no ceremony or grand strategy, only a circle of frostbitten soldiers forcing themselves forward because to stop was to die. They fought with bayonets and shattered musket stocks, with fists when steel slipped from numb hands. The snow beneath their boots churned into a dark slush. Afghan fighters pressed in close, quick and fearless, their knives finding gaps in wool and flesh. The mountains amplified every scream, then swallowed it. The British line buckled, then surged, then buckled again, like a ship being torn by reefs. A few officers shouted for order, but order was a luxury of armies that still had breath. What held the survivors together now was not command, it was desperation. Men stepped over their own wounded. They shoved aside comrades who fell in front of them. Some tried to help, then saw the wall of Afghan steel and chose the living over the dying. War strips away the stories we tell ourselves about what we are. In that corridor, it left only what we truly are when fear takes the reins. Somehow, by sheer stubborn momentum, they broke through the barricade. The Afghans gave ground not because they were defeated, but because they did not need to finish the work there. The road beyond the rocks rose in thin, cruel switchbacks. The tribes melted back to the heights, already drifting toward the next killing ground. The British pushed forward in silence, not celebrating, not even speaking. They had passed through one mouth of death only to see, ahead, a chain of other mouths waiting. They reached Jugdulluk late that day, a pass so tight and steep it felt less like a road than a wound cut into the mountainside. Snow lay deep here. Packed hard by wind, the cliffs leaned closer as if to listen. Most of the camp followers were gone now. The great river of 16,000 had dwindled to a cinder. Men who had once laughed in Kabul's winter salons now stumbled like ghosts, their beards white with frost, their eyes hollowed by hunger and loss. At Jugdulluk, the Afghans struck again. They had built a crude breastwork across the net, throat of the pass, and filled the ridges above with riflemen. The survivors saw it in the failing light and understood at once what it meant. This was not harassment. This was closure. The mountains were about to shut. They tried to charge. There was no other choice. A ragged front of redcoats and seep lurched forward, firing as they went, slipping on ice, falling, rising, firing again. Afghan Jazils answered from above, calm and lethal. Men toppled backward into drifts, dragging others with them. The pass became a funnel of bullets. Those behind pressed forward, those ahead died in place, and the whole column ground against the barricade like a blade against stone. When the charge failed, it failed quietly. Not in a single dramatic collapse, but in exhaustion spreading like ink through water. The survivors curled behind rocks, panting mist into the air. Some cried out in rage. Others stared at the barricade and did not move. The Afghans kept firing, then stopped. They were not rushing in yet. They were waiting for the cold and despair to do their work. That night was the coldest yet. Wind screamed through the gap, turning breath to ice on eyelashes. The survivors tried to sleep in shifts, but sleep became treachery. Men who closed their eyes did not open them. A drummer boy was found at dawn, sitting upright against a rock as if on guard. His hands frozen on his knees, his face still turned. Toward the road ahead, sepoys lay tangled together, their feet bare, their fingers locked as if trying to share the last warmth between them. When the living saw the dead, they did not even flinch anymore. The shock had burned out. Grief had turned into a tired, dull ache. At first light, they moved again, because stillness meant being surrounded. The Afghan barricade was partly abandoned now, as if to lure them onward. The survivors crept through, expecting another volley. It never came. That silence was worse than gunfire. It felt like a smile you couldn't see. They stumbled down into the valley beyond, and there the final shape of the retreat revealed itself. Not one column now, but scattered knots, men separated. By darkness and panic, each group no longer sure who commanded or even who lived. Elphinstone was gone, taken into Akbar Khan's custody days earlier, another hostage swallowed by the mountains. The senior officers who remained were dead or missing. Leadership had dissolved into whoever still had the strength to push forward. And then, as noon bled into afternoon, the survivors saw smoke in the distance. For a heartbeat, hope flared. Smoke meant habitation. It meant food. It meant warmth. It might even mean Jalalabad. They hurried toward it, feet sinking into drifts, muscles screaming. But as they neared the ridge, the truth arrived like a blade between ribs. The smoke did not rise from friendly fires. It rose from Afghan campfire, lining the heights in a broad half-circle. They had been herded here. The valley was a bowl. The ridges were walls. The road ran straight through the middle like a spine laid bare. The Afghans appeared on both flanks at once, riders first, then footmen spilling down the slopes. The survivors tried to form a square. Their muskets misfired in the cold. Their ammunition was almost gone. Some fought anyway, firing their last rounds, then falling back on bayonets. Shook in their hands. Others broke and ran, only to be ridden down in the snow. The valley filled with the sound of a final unraveling, shots, screams, horses, on the left. Relentless drum of feet crushing through ice. What happened there did not last long. It didn't need to. The survivors were too few, too broken, and too cold to resist for more than moments. By sunset, the snow road of death had taken almost all it intended to take. A small remnant escaped in ragged streams, officers and soldiers, who had found side gullies, who had crawled through brush and rock while the main slaughter unfolded below. They were not a unit anymore. They were prey that had slipped the net. Among them rode a single man whose name would become legend in two empires. Dr. William Bridden, a surgeon, sat on a dying pony wrapped in a torn cloak, his skull battered, blood frozen on his face. He had, a sword cut in his helmet and a bullet wound in his shoulder. The pony staggered more than trotted, and each time it faltered, Bridan leaned forward, whispering to it like to a friend. He had no escort. He had no map that meant anything anymore. He had only the instinct to follow the road downhill and the will to stay in the saddle one more mile. The last miles to Jalalabad were a blur of white and red. Sometimes he heard riders behind him and forced the pony to a desperate burst. Sometimes he saw shapes on ridges and waited until dusk to move. He passed bodies, half buried in snow, British, sepoy, Afghan, all equally stiff now under the same indifferent winter. He saw a child's scarf fluttering from a bush. He saw a broken cannon wheel like a relic of some other life. On the afternoon of January 13, 1842, Jalalabad's walls emerged through the haze. British sentries watched from the ramparts, scanning the road for days, expecting a broken column, hoping for a miracle. What they saw instead was a single rider swaying in the saddle, riding as if at the end of the world. When Bridan reached the gate, he could barely speak. The garrison rushed out, catching him as he slid from his pony. "Where is the army?" someone asked. "I am the army," he whispered. Inside Jalalabad, the news spread like fire through dry straw. The Kabul garrison was gone. The retreat had been a massacre. An empire that had walked into Afghanistan with drums and banners had walked out as a rumor carried by one bleeding man. But the story did not end at Jalalabad's gates. In Kabul, Shah Shuja still sat on a crumbling throne, trembling behind palace walls that no longer protected him. Akbar Khan held British hostages in the mountains, bargaining with lives he now owned. In India, the British command seethed with shame and fury, already gathering a new army for vengeance. Winter still gripped the pass. Snow still lay over the road that had eaten 16,000 souls, and somewhere in that white silence, between Kabul and Jalalabad, the hostages waited, not knowing whether the next knock on their door would be a promise of release, or the footstep of a fate as cold as the mountains themselves.